Hello, this is Sharon Roberson, President and CEO of the YWCA Nashville and Middle Tennessee. We will begin the webinar in just a few minutes. Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Roberson, President and CEO of the YWCA Nashville and Middle Tennessee, and I welcome you to the next segment of the YWCA Stand Against Racism Virtual Lunch and Learn series. Today, I'm very excited because we're going to discuss a topic that's often not discussed in a very meaningful fashion, and this is mental health and people of color. It's very important for we as a community to understand that different experiences that people face throughout their lives truly affects their mental health status. And we've all been through the pandemic, and all Americans, really people worldwide, have had to deal with a lot of issues related to COVID-19. However, people of color and other marginalized groups have had to deal with the stress of the pandemic as well as other stressors. Processing and dealing with layers of individual trauma from COVID-19, we understand the isolation, the uncertainty, the grief, both personal in human terms and financial. We know that we've had to look at police violence displayed on our television screens and in the other forms of media. We've also had to deal with divisive political rhetoric, which has added layers to the very complex environment that already existed. People of color have had to deal with these issues, and this trauma has taken its toll. Today, we're going to talk about various issues involving the mental health status and barriers that exist in our society for a long term that have really just been exacerbated by the environmental factors of the most recent years. We also want to acknowledge the anti-Asian hate crimes, Islamophobia, and also anti-Semitism that has also risen during these times, and the emotional and psychological stressors that exist as a result of that. Unfortunately, the journey for seeking mental health treatment for many marginalized groups, but especially for people of color, is impacted by the systemic and interpersonal racism. Our panel today will guide us to a more of an understanding of how the virus, and I call it a virus, of racism has infiltrated the mental health system and what we can do to make mental health care a more equitable service. Before we get started, I would like to thank the Nissan Foundation for making this webinar possible and free. This conversation is much needed, and this forward-thinking corporation has supported us in this endeavor. We also want to thank a new peace sponsor, PNC Bank. Thank you for the significant and important support. Before we get started, I want to make sure that everyone understands the YW seeks to have informative conversations in the community. We say that we invite people to the table for these discussions, that we do not indict you. There is no question or no position that we do not want to hear. We seek to educate every member of our community so that they have the tools necessary to have valid conversations and to make this community the best that it can be. We'll start off with each of the panelists. I want you to introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about your background and the work that you do. We will start with Dr. Kelly.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Desiree Kelly, and I have worked as a mental health educator and facilitator for the last 3 years, but it seems like it's literally an ongoing journey. I accepted a position at Tennessee Primary Care Association as the Workforce Strategies and Evaluation Manager in February of 2021. With this position, I'm able to contribute to minimizing issues related to institutional racism, professional burnout, and other barriers related to workforce development in community health centers around the state. So to get back with the question, racism is a mental health issue because racism causes trauma, and trauma paints a different line to mental illness, which needs to be taken seriously. Unfortunately, people of color experience far more subtle traumas every day. Work microaggressions, banks and credit companies unwilling to lend money and only willing to do it at a higher rate, mass incarceration of peers, school curricula that ignore or minimize contributions of our shared history, and racial profiling.
Well, Dr. Ash, same question. Introduce yourself and the work that you do.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Marilyn Ash, and I'm originally was a special education teacher working, helping youth emotional and behavioral disordered children. And so I taught for 6 years, and I came out of the school system because they only wanted us to work on 6 weeks of social skills training. And then the rest was geared toward academics. And I'm like, okay, God, I need to know what my position is. And so I came out of the school system and I decided to go into counseling. And so I got my master's in counseling. Then I got my doctorate in counselor education and supervision. And so I've been doing counseling for over 18 years, working with youth and individuals and families. And it has been an experience with dealing with different populations of people of color, whether they were incarcerated or out in the free world, like those who are detained. However, my work has been on developing them mentally and helping them to get mentally well, because a lot of times people don't understand the difference between mental health and mental illness. And so that's what my platform is helping people to understand the difference and then work toward whatever their goals are. And that's has been my experience, especially with people of color, because as we know that our culture was, you tell the pastor, he gonna pray it out, and everything was gonna be all right. And so from there, it was like, no, Jesus gave all of us some gifts. And so we do need somebody else to help us. Just as if you're going to the doctor, you do need to have somebody to talk to when it comes to your mental health. And so I think that was the barrier for most of our people of color. And now they're getting it. So I'm glad we're having these type of conversations to help our people to seek out help when they most need it, which is now.
All right, well, Dr. Williams, same questions. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
Yes, of course. Fix my camera here so you guys see my whole face. Hey, I am Dr. Tiffany Williams. I am at the Tennessee State University working as an assistant professor in the master's and doctoral counseling psychology programs. And so I would like to describe myself as having 3 roles. So as a trainer, I'm producing new practitioners by teaching our new students, hopefully more students of color, to become psychologists and counselors. And I'm also licensed as a psychologist with the Health Service professional designation in Ohio and Tennessee. And so as a practitioner, I feel like it is my duty to ensure that I stay connected with the community and work with people of color who often seek me out because there are so few of us. And so that would be my second role. And then my third role that I'm really passionate about is as scientist slash researcher. Essentially, I like to investigate how systemic oppression, such as racial discrimination, impacts people of color's mental health. And not only how, but what interventions, can I identify that are culturally appropriate to help, people experiencing mental health conditions, especially as it relates to their experiences of oppression. And so along the same lines, the first question that we were told to respond to, honestly, this last 2 years have been insane. Um, and people call it a double pandemic, but I feel like there is more than just racism and COVID that's happening. I feel like there is a tremendous amount of grief that we are experiencing as a community in relation to violence, in relation to COVID. I feel that the health disparities that have always existed, have returned to remind us that we need to do a better job, to help our community, especially in terms of health and mental health. And then this new thing that I've been investigating is systemic trauma. And with systemic trauma, I feel like as a direct or indirect recipient of racism, you can experience trauma symptoms and it can impact your life, And so I want to ensure that, as we're talking today, that we're not talking about just individuals that have a direct experience of trauma, or excuse me, a direct experience of racial discrimination, but, indirect experience as we're watching some of these violent acts and violence and hate, that happen across POC communities. So thanks for having me.
All right, well, we'll stay with you just a little bit, Dr. Williams.
Okay.
We know that care in our country is not available to some and is available to others. So there is an inequality already built into our system. If I'm a person of color and I know that I need to seek mental health care, what would be a barrier? Why would it be difficult for me to get the level of quality of care that I need?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to save some answers for the other panelists, but there are a multitude of them, and I'm sure that we're all going to talk about some of the similar things. But I would say that the first two that stand out, well, the first three that stand out to me is cultural mistrust. So not really trusting the healthcare system. I mean, and who would blame us? It's been enrooted and steeped in racism. I would also say stigma. When you look at the news, mental health, mental illness is not perceived in a very favorable light. And so fear of getting services, due to stigma or being taught that mental health care or seeking help is not a good thing, I would say it can also serve as a barrier. And then lack of resources. I mean, okay, perfect example. So I'm new to Nashville. I just got here about 3 years ago. This is my third year. And one thing that I've noticed here is a lot of the practitioners will charge cash for services.
Mhm.
And I'm like, that's great. And you're limiting, the people that can access these resources, which is why my small little caseload probably stays so high because I accept insurance, And so just that as a simple example, like just lack of resources, or being able to access, the care that's needed can serve as a barrier.
All right. Well, Dr. Ash, in your opening statement, you discussed the issue of, a history or a desire to pray away some of these issues. You also made a distinction between mental health and mental illness. Can you give us a little bit more on those two issues?
Okay, so people of color, again, we had, and it was ingrained in from our elders that, it's like, we don't take your business outside the house. And so it had to stay within the home. And so you don't bring it out. So that means nobody's going to be able to help you because you're expecting the people in the home who are limited in knowledge of helping you to not share with anybody, because they would just say stuff like, don't go in Uncle Joe's room because he's not right in the head. So that stigma stuck with our culture that you don't go out and you don't go telling anybody your business. You're just gonna have to pray and work it out. And so even back then, they didn't know that there was a difference between mental health issues and mental health, period. So they would get them mixed up. So there's mental illness, there's mental health. So if I'm mentally well, then I'm functioning. I'm functioning from day to day. But if I'm sad, or if I'm having some anxiety or some depression, they don't know what that looks like. So they don't know that it's out of the norm. So they don't know who to go see for that, to get some help. But nowadays, there are some available resources with the mental illness. And somewhere in between, in the continuum, we've all had something challenging for mental health. Something was challenging for us, and it was working on our psyche or our mental wellness that was being interrupted, and we didn't know where to go to get help, because not always did we go to primary care, and they couldn't provide what we needed. They may have given them some medicine, said, look, I could give you a little something for your depression, for your sadness, and then send them on their way. But there still wasn't no therapy. So there had to be something to help people to be able to survive and to move forward. And so that's where it was limited back then. But now we have the availability, but we just got to get the word out to our people that there are services available. And yes, there is a lack. I agree with Dr. Williams and Dr. Kelly. There's a lack of clinicians, of people of color that are offering services that are licensed, or they're only taking cash. And I'm even going to throw this out, some of them don't even respond when somebody reaches out to them, which is a bad thing puts a bad stigma on people getting mental health. So I would say that, as long we keep on having these conversations and going out and advocating for these people to get mental health, because my experience with the people I'm seeing now in my private practice, I do work full time, but even in the private practice, it is overwhelming for me. And I have to put a cap on trying to, doing the self-care for myself, because we have a lot of people who are in need. And I wish we did have more clinicians who are willing to step up and help us with this role of getting our communities well.
All right. Well, Dr. Kelly, give us some more flavor around the barriers that exist. We know that there are some internal factors within the community, but there are also the external factors, that have been compounded by, I call the multiple epidemics that we're facing. Flavor on that.
Well, thank you, Sharon, first for giving me this opportunity. This is my passion. This is where I live, right? So I'm going to add to what Dr. Williams and Dr. Ash said, but let's stop with mental health and mental illness. People actually treat those terms like they mean the same thing, and they do not. A lot of conversations that we have, and anytime I start out a presentations to adults or kids, I'll ask them, hey, does everybody have a mental illness? And they'll be like, oh, Dr. Kelly, you're trying to trick us. You're right. I am. I want you to know the difference. So let's talk about it. So mental health is our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It's how we feel, how we think, how we act. This is when people say, hey, I'm checking in with you. What's your mental health for today? And they'll say, I'm feeling kind of sad. I'm actually excited and empowered. Those are feelings. That's stuff that we feel. But then when we pivot to mental illness, it's the absence of illness or disorder. So when you do that and people start thinking, they're like, oh, okay, that's what that means. I was like, that's what that means. And I want you to know, because once we know, what can we do? We can change the conversation. We can normalize it, and we can stop stigma. So Dr. Williams, I'm about to park on what you said, because this is where my passion lies as well. Cultural stigma around mental health care is a huge barrier for us. The discrimination and the general lack of awareness about mental illness. And so African Americans, we are usually taught, I'm pivoting over to you, Dr. Ash, now, to hide our true feelings, as displaying emotions often characterized as violent, aggressive, or angry. How many women on this call, on this panel, has heard angry Black woman? I don't want to be in that category. Okay, I don't want that type of frustration, right? So don't categorize me as an angry Black woman just because I spoke and I'm passionate and my voice might be a little bit louder. Okay, so another thing Dr. Ash said that I want to provide a little insight on, my generations and the generations before us, we began compartmentalizing mental health issues in childhood due to the shame associated with talking openly about mental health symptoms with a loved one, with a community member, with a healthcare professional. I was that family member where the matriarchs in my family was like, don't go down to that basement because so-and-so's there. Don't go down there without an adult. And as a kid, you're thinking, okay, what's going to happen? Because you think the worst as a kid, right? And you're nervous. And then you hear chatter about using those stigmatizing terms. They're crazy. They're cray-cray, right? They're crazier than a Betsy bug. My goodness, I've heard that over and over again. So we turn to our religion and our religious leaders to cope with our psychological issues. But guess what? The two can exist. No one ever said they couldn't coexist. It's just not a choice between one or the other. It's both. Pray and go to your doctor. Take prescribed medication and go to therapy. So a few years back, and then I'm gonna give it back to you, Sharon. I told you I was gonna park it here for a second. I spoke to a group of high school students at a local school about mental illness versus mental health. 1 out of every 10 students were members of the BIPOC community. And for people who don't know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So 1 out of 10, so 150, there might have been maybe 10 or 11 diverse kids in that group. So I asked the students to close their eyes and imagine hearing on the news that multiple women and children were shot at a local store. I said, the police have identified the shooter. The shooter was diagnosed with a mental illness and suffering from delusions. Updates are forthcoming. Then I asked the students to open their eyes and describe the shooter. What do they look like? How old are they? These are the comments that I heard. Oh, it's a Black man. It's a Black teenager. Oh, they're in their 20s. They're older. They're homeless. They're wearing disheveled clothing. They're definitely unemployed. Okay. This conversation went on for 10 minutes. And although we discussed the recent news and the mass shooting demographics, which are not usually associated with people of color, students had a difficulty understanding the mischaracterization of the BIPOC community in the news. So we have to raise awareness with these issues by mobilizing and normalizing mental health conversations because we got to make a difference.
Okay, well, I'll go back to you, Dr. Kelly, because we, at the beginning of this conversation, talked about all these external factors, police violence that we see in the media. We see, a lot of hatred in the media, political rhetoric that works against, understanding and learning our history. All of those things are just there every day. And it's not only there for adults, children hear this and children learn this, and children who are ill-equipped really to deal with the trauma that they're facing. What impact does race have, given all these external factors, on your mental health? And even going into someone that may suffer from mental illness that could be triggered by some of the events that occurred. Give us some more flavor around that.
Well, I appreciate this question because I'm a mom of a 15-year-old going on 50. Right? So I hear it all. I see it all. He sees it all, right? One of the things that we can do as parents is monitor their platform. But there have been significant declines in mental health that have been observed and reported, particularly pre-COVID. So we have all this stuff pre-COVID, and then we're going into a pandemic. None of this stuff was addressed, right? We didn't tap into our support circles or talk to our therapists. And we definitely are seeing it in our children because they were aggressive before COVID. Now they're angry, aggressive, and hostile. And so nobody is actually addressing that, but the clinicians, and they are overwhelmed. And Dr. Williams, I'm gonna have to say, I send a lot of people to Dr. Ash. Now I'm about to send a lot to you. It's just easier for me. I'm just gonna throw that up. She'll text me and say, stop sending stuff. But I want people to have contact with people who have been through their experiences. So back to you and your question, Sharon, while we are able to limit our interaction with news and social media platforms, we cannot control the uninvited acts of racial profiling, microaggressions, and racism. And these factors, these experiences, these lived experiences are a major contributing factor when we feel sad, depressed, anxious, stressed, right? So it is essential to have a strong support system, a dependable therapist, right? So if you're on the call, what I would do is get these women's contact numbers and see if you can get in where you get in, right? And another way is to practice self-care. You got to make time for self-care and your version of self-care. My self-care might not look like Dr. Ash. It might not look like Sharon's, but nobody's going to tell me that it's not important to me and it's not giving me a take a moment and pause, because there's power in the pause.
Well, Dr. Ash, sometimes it seems as though not only the 15-year-old going on 50, but all of us can get a sense of anger. And anger on top of your trauma is a very dangerous thing.
Mm-hmm.
What would you advise us? Because race impacts how we react to things. And it may be your last time that you can really take an issue. Let me tell you a little bit short story. I was in a store checking out, and I went to both Vanderbilt undergraduate school and law school. And I just happened to have really what was a gift to me was a fleece jacket with Vanderbilt on it. And a woman that worked at the register at the store said that, she says, "Oh, did you go to Vanderbilt, or did one of your children play ball there?" Now that seems very innocent, but this has happened to me time and time again, as if believing that the only avenue a person has to go to Vanderbilt would be based on some athletic prowess. And nothing wrong with that. But for some reason, it really hit me really negatively. And I knew I had to pull inside myself to understand that it wasn't really about that. Mm-hmm. But talked about how these added really what really we term microaggressions in your life, given all the factors that are going on today, can really make you angry.
I agree, Ms. Robertson. The thing is that I've experienced some of the same things. Is it's like I introduce myself, especially in the arena of knowing who my audience is as Dr. Berilyn Ash, and then I still have people turn around and say Berilyn, and then I'll say yes, Dr. Ash, and I'm still hit with these microaggressions of, oh, so where'd you get your degree at? And I would ask them which one. I have 3 of them. And I went to 3 different universities. So which one? So my undergraduate degree has nothing to do with counseling. So what are you really asking me? So, and that's the kind of stuff that we have to let them know exactly what it is that we do, and help them with their microaggressions, because our youth that I work with mainly with my full-time job have experienced those microaggressions. And so they feel that they have to approve themselves by doing what they do. And so I work with them on restorative justice, restoring what the harm you've caused to other people. And they don't even realize with that they have caused harm. I had one youth tell me, he says that, well, people, that he's been locked up 3 times for stealing a car. And I told him he wasn't good at his job. You need to try something else. So I'm gonna help you with finding something else that you do well. And he says, well, they didn't want their car because they left the keys in it. I said, really? I said, so help me understand. I said, because I'm gonna help you understand once you tell me. Well, she left the keys in it, so I took a car. And so I shared with them, I said, you do not have the right to come on my property to take my car in that I left my keys in my car. What gave you the right to do that? And then how much are you getting for those cars? And they told me the max he got was $150. I was like, and so you've been in juvenile detention 3 times for stealing a car 3 times. You're not good at it. Let me help you find something else you're good at. So they don't know. They have no clue. They just acting on impulse of doing what they think is right because they see what other people are doing. So their right is not our right. So we got to help them see what the right is. And they always say, well, I need, that's normal for us at our house. Okay, I know, but don't you want to do something different? So we've got to teach them something different. Not only them, but also their those who live in the house with them. Could be anybody, it's family members, whoever the caregivers. I have some who live in the hotels. They don't know where the next meal is coming from. But if we don't train them We don't teach them that, you know, you're in juvenile detention, but you don't want to go to school, but they making you go to school. I said, what else you got to do? You can't go nowhere. So the thing is, the problem is that they don't know. So it's our role in to help them. And so when they're presented with these microaggressions for these people who say these ill things to them, you don't have to get mad and take it out on somebody else. You just have to show. Some people you could tell, but other people you have to show. So I always work with them to be the example, to show them what it looks like, and through their lens. And that's what we have to work on, to help them to see through their lens, because the other people with the microaggressions, they see through their lens.
And that's very important. I'll go to you, Dr. Williams, because so often we work with a lot of young people at the YWCA, and I feel the anger, especially in our young men and our Men Together program. I feel their anger, and it almost seems weak to tell them you have to hold your emotions back in some form in order to survive in society, so we don't end up in that, school to prison pipeline. Because I've told many young men, even at our Weaver Domestic Violence Center, and these are kids that have witnessed a lot of violence, that if you act out your anger in a violent fashion, our society has very little tolerance for Black male anger. In fact, zero tolerance. It is criminalized. So Dr. Williams, help us a little bit with this anger issue. Help us a little bit, because, if you carried your anger as a Black person in society, you will be a Black person in prison. So about that.
Yes, say it. That's right. Okay, the first thing that stands out to me is we have to recognize what's happening internally with us. Anger is a primary emotion. Usually it's followed by friends, guilt, shame, things like that. And so the three things that I like to talk to my clients about is, when you wake up in the morning, assess where you're at. If you're feeling agitated, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling irritable, how about we identify that and recognize it first? Where are you at? What are your needs today? And then after you're checking in with yourself, okay, do you need to unplug? Do you need some boundaries? Because no, I did not watch George Floyd. I didn't watch that video. I knew what it was going to do to me. So how do we help people recognize what they can handle and what they don't need to handle? It's not necessary for you to see, someone lose their last breath, lose their life, and what kind of internal toll that can take. And then process. You don't have to keep your emotions to yourself. Talk to somebody. It don't even have to be a therapist. Talk to somebody. What's going on with you? One thing that I've been studying more recently is radical healing and resistance to racism based on storytelling, and so sharing with people what you're experiencing, how you're experiencing it, having a space to process all the events of 2020, can help us at least understand what we're feeling. If it's anger, if it's sadness, if it's depression. Because what happens at the end of the day, if we don't handle what we're experiencing, if we don't handle how we feel about it, it turns out as what? Anxiety, disordered eating, depression. And then who does that help? And one other thing that I think is really important to mention. So when you're assessing yourself, I don't want people to just think about emotions. I want you to think about physically, what is your body doing? You got stomach aches, irritable bowel, headaches, because we know with people of color, oftentimes we're experiencing mental health symptoms somatically. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We can't sleep. We're exhausted. Our stomach hurts, or we can't keep food down, and so when you're doing that, mind body assessment, ensuring that you are assessing for, small and subtle changes that your body might be experiencing. Without awareness, how are you going to heal from anything,
Well, Dr. Williams, I had another question for you, but something you said really intrigued me, and I want you to go in a little more detail. This healing, because we know there's mind, body, and spirit, and all those things flow together, and either one of those three are out of sync is not a good situation, especially for people of color. Tell me a little bit more about this radical healing concept.
Sure. So radical healing is something that's that's been tossed about in liberation psychology in our division 17 of American Psychological Association. And essentially, we're talking about, healing from experiences of oppression through critical consciousness, awareness, resistance. And the only way that, people can engage in resistance is if we talk about it, challenge the system. Healing can happen when you are an active participant in change, in social justice and advocacy. And it's really important, to be mindful that that doesn't mean that you have to be out there protesting. What is your way of enacting social justice, change, and radical healing? For me, for example, I like to create spaces to process, like what's happening. It could be with clients, it could be with colleagues. Sometimes I need to process, or so I've even had been guilty of having one, we get some bad news about some court, whatever, and in class, nobody's listening and I'm not. We're like, you know what, forget the content. Let's talk about what happened today because that's really affecting me. That's part of healing, radical healing. Does that make sense?
Right, very good, very good. And Dr. Ash, the next question was things that could be done to make mental health care more accessible. But let me talk to you about what I call, in my viewpoint, adaptive behavior, the behavior that people of color have to use every day just to survive. Because as I've said before, the angry Black person ends up in not so the best circumstances. And whether you like it or not, that's the playing field that's before us. Tell us a little bit more about how to maneuver through this angry environment without being that angry person. That's the most difficult challenge that I've had, even in working with people within a nonprofit situation, how we get through that, what we can do, and what resources might be there for us.
So I think people have the negative connotation that, you're not supposed to get angry. We all get angry, but it's what you do once you become angry. So am I going to lash out? Am I going to fight? Or what am I going to do? So am I going to respond inappropriately? What is I'm doing? So people have to understand first, when I'm angry, then I need to step back and find out, why am I angry? Like Dr. Williams and Dr. Kelly have mentioned, that we got to know what's going on with ourselves physically and emotionally before we can respond to somebody. So people won't think it before they respond. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary that I'm about to get what I'm about to say? And sometimes it might be true, but am I going to give it to you kind? And is it necessary to give it to that person at that time? So anger does take a toll on a lot of people. And that's what causes a lot of the mental instability that they'll have, because they'll make some irrational decisions, which will affect them later. Because there will be a consequence, whether it's positive or negative. So in finding some help or seeking help about the anger, you got to know what it is that's causing you a trigger for you. What are your triggers? And if I know that the people you're coming up against, I'm going to a meeting or I'm going somewhere, I've got to go speak to somebody, I got to go speak to the judge, and you're angry because the judge said that you got to go to juvenile detention or you got to go serve some time. You angry, and then you react, you disrupt in the courtroom. So you don't think there's going to be additional consequences. So it's incumbent on us to understand how we react when we become angry. And I think that's a lot of things that might be the first and foremost thing that people have to realize, how I react when I become angry. And that might help them in making some better decisions. And sometimes people say they got to act immediately. Some things require you to act immediately, but some things don't. And so if you take 3 seconds to think about what I'm getting ready to say, challenge those automatic thoughts. It's like, I got to tell them off because so-and-so used to talk to me like that. So I'm going to say X, Y, and Z, and then go in this alphabet of unkind words, and then, thinking that I'm going to use this and this is going to disrupt what I'm, what I'm saying, disrupt this person. And so my advice, my to especially to adults who work with whomever, think about how you're going to react when somebody is angry. And so your response may help them to change the way that they're going to respond or react to whatever it is they're really angry about. Because 9 times out of 10, it's not you that they're angry with. They're angry about a situation. And we just have to help them to figure out, let's work through how you're going to respond to some anger when you're angry.
All right. Kelly, you were shaking your head in agreement. Can you add to this conversation?
Oh, she did such a wonderful job. I always got stuff to add. You have to rein me in. It's so many great points that she made. So she made a statement about, emotional intelligence, manage your emotions. When you're dealing with so much of the population, I mean, I deal with this day to day. Somebody say something off color, and Sharon, when that comment was made to you, man, that was reminiscent of my brother in high school, the whole ride of them talking to my mom and him, going to college, because they're off color comments. And I have to decide, am I going to give you that energy that I have, or am I going to manage it and not suppress it? Because me suppressing stuff, nobody wants that. That's not going to be good for anybody or healthy. So what I need to do is manage it and look at steps to process. So there's so many great things that she said, but I want to get back to your initial question. There's a real sense of emotional hesitation because many of us, African Americans, people of color, we're not taught about emotions. And research backs that up. We don't learn how to share and process with someone unfamiliar. And that's very intimidating. A lot of the questions that I get as an educator and a facilitator and somebody that has a lot of resources is, okay, how do I navigate the process? How do I even find a therapist, right? I want a therapist that looks like me. So, I mean, over the last year, particularly when COVID sent everybody home the first wave, I know I had 10 calls from various school districts asking me, hey, who can we get for our little brown kids because they need help? Absolutely, they've always needed help. So let me just give you a resource sheet. But often people don't know where to start when searching for a therapist, who fits their needs, what questions to ask a potential therapist when they're meeting for the first time. And then understanding that whole concept that therapy is necessary and super duper helpful. So you got to speak to somebody who's knowledgeable and advocate about your mental health. And don't just stop at that one recommendation. This is your mental health. Advocate for yourself. Look at a couple other people. I have burnt Dr. Ash just following up saying, okay, so give me this, give me the lowdown because I'm referring. And Dr. Williams, you're looking like, But now that I have your information, I'll be burning your phone up too. I want to provide resources to people of color because they deal with so many different lived experiences. And another couple of things before we pivot, utilize your EAP services at work. That's amazing. That's a wonderful outlet, right? I've heard so many people say to me, well, I don't like the therapist at the EAP. Okay, well, you know what? I didn't either. And so I found an African-American woman therapist and asked her, how do I get her put on EAP services? Yeah. It took 2 or 3 different channels, but I got it done. So don't just stop at that one barrier because, oh, I'm not going to get it done. No, you matter. Your mental health matters, right? And then research and find that therapist and be prepared to have barriers, right? And go with 3 people, right? Because at the end of the day, I want you to be able to find somebody that fits so you can get the best services possible.
All right, well, I'm going to go a little off script because I'm going to ask a question. This is real. And because I see I have all the people I need to respond to this question, it's going to be very important. There's a very high profile trial. I won't get into the specifics of it, but the person, the actual defendant took the stand in this trial. She is a white female. And in her testimony, she started to cry. And the person that was commenting on the trial felt as though those tears would garner a lot of sympathy with the jury. And they said that she never appeared angry, etc. This was a sort of a tool this commentator thought for her to garner sympathy. I've seen in our domestic violence work that the trauma that's shown to some people through tears has a more positive reaction than a real trauma that's shown through outbursts and anger. Do you all get where I'm going? Give me a little bit about that. I'll start with you. I'll go a little bit out of sync. Dr. Ash, you were shaking your head. the way that I think trauma is shown, or trauma is shown to the world by people of different colors, garners a different reaction in our society. And if that doesn't make sense, just ask me to clarify the question.
Yes, please clarify.
All right. I'm getting to what we have called in our society the privilege of white girl tears and Black female anger. And those two fitting together, the reaction of our society to those differences and emotions, however true, but learned. Why does our society react differently to one versus the other?
I'm not quite sure of why they act differently. And I guess it's because people don't understand people's different lived experiences. So if I'm unable to interpret what that person is feeling, maybe because she's not shedding a tear or she's not responding the way they think they should respond, she's either angry or she's lacking some skill of some kind. That's my experience of mostly that we were angry. And this is why we didn't respond the way that people thought we, even in that particular situation you're talking about, because I watched it, and to say that she was trying to garner sympathy, or, it was, it struck me with a chord. It's like, okay, why are we always categorized as being angry or not, or fearful, or we're trying to garner something, or we're looking for something in return? That may not be everybody's ultimate goal for it. Maybe some, but not everybody. So you putting all of us in the same pot, saying that this is how the Black women gonna act. Boom, we gonna show out. You gonna look. You came for me, I'm coming for you. And that's not always the way we respond. And so they were looking for, because they prejudged her.
Yes.
And that's what happened. Yeah. So, and I think that's why the reaction becomes that, because they prejudged it by maybe the color of her skin and her gender.
Okay. All right. Very good take. Very good. Dr. Williams.
I completely agree, Dr. Ash. The first two things that came to mind to me is Superwoman and Strong Black Woman. Okay, I'm sorry, Angry Black Woman. Okay, those two racial stereotypes and how people perceive Black women. We're not perceived as delicate and, as okay to cry when feeling some kind of way. That is not how mainstream culture perceives Black women, and so this irritates me a bit, because I'm thinking about actual people who have experienced trauma, and I'm like, crying is not necessarily a symptom that someone is going to experience, nor should it be used to evaluate how, traumatized someone must be. And so I agree with Dr. Ash. I think it really does have to do with these racialized stereotypes that have been around for centuries, and, the perceptions that people have about Black people, and what they expect Black women to look like, and what they expect for us to respond to, depending on the stimuli. So.
And Dr. Kelly, we have several different people that I've seen come up in the chat, and they actually work in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault. So these are practitioners. What advice can you give them that will help them navigate through a system, especially if they are not a person of color themselves, through a system where they have women, especially of color, who suffered significant trauma? Can you give them some advice?
So I'm definitely also going to refer to the clinicians on the call, but my lived experience has actually shown me several different things. First, be very vigilant and present. Listen to hear, not to respond. And then when you do respond, it's not a cookie cutter definition, right? And so I think Dr. Ash and Dr. Williams did a beautiful job of explaining some of the barriers and issues that we deal with. I can just remember one in particular that those stereotypes are real and they're real with our children. I presented at a school and afterwards I'm bright and shiny, right? So every kid's gonna come up to me and ask a question, but I always make sure I have an arsenal of my clinicians ready to go. Because the first thing I tell kids, I'm not a clinician, I'm an educator, right? And I wanna provide you with the information so you can be prepared, right? So I had a young African-American lady and she was 12, 13, and it hits differently when you see a young lady that you can see some of yourself being say that she's cutting because the stress is so bad, right? And she learned it from her friend. So immediately I went into training mode because of course I'm trained in various suicide and mental health curriculums, but I wanted to make sure she was okay. And meanwhile, multitasking or switch tasking, because multitasking is a myth, but switch tasking is sending a text message saying, I need you now to the clinician. And the clinician was probably, she looks like America's sweetheart. Okay. So the first thing she said to me was, but she's problematic. So what does that mean? I don't really care about that. And so what you have just now told me is now my mission in life is to check in with this young lady on a monthly basis to make sure that you're giving her the services that she needs. I don't care that she's problematic. She's cutting. Do something about it. And so just that stereotypical thought right there crushed me, because if I was not there, will we ignore her? What would happen in those situations? So we have to listen, to hear, and put those stereotypes aside so you can get to the root of the problem and then refer. You don't have to know everything, just have friends that know stuff, right? So you can move on to their expertise. But we have to help our young generation because they're struggling.
Dr. Ash, give some of these non BIPOC clinicians some advice on how to work with the people of color who have suffered trauma.
So in my experience, in providing supervision to some interns who are BIPOC. So trying to help them understand, you have to, and we hear the term all the time, meet them where they are, but you have to know where they are to meet them there. And so if you don't know where they are to meet them there, then you're going to struggle, because then you need to refer them to somebody who can help them and meet them where they are. Because some of them, you know, not only, Dr. Kelly mentioned it, and listen to hear, and I always tell them to listen for understanding. You have to listen for understanding to know what you're working with. And if you can't listen for understanding and you're just ready to respond, oh, I think you're sad, let's do this, we're going to work with this. That's not our role. Our role as clinicians is listening for understanding to help them to reach the goals they want, not the ones, I can give them goals all day long, but they may not be able to reach them. So we got to listen for understanding. And that's what I would tell other clinicians and even those who are learning, you know, when I'm doing supervision for, you know, in upcoming counselors or in therapists, you got to listen to understand what it is, the needs of each client, and it's different for everybody. It looks different for everybody. Everybody, yes, we may be sad, we may be depressed, we may have anxiety, but not to say stuff like, oh yeah, you having a panic attack. I know what that looks like because I have them all the time. Well, it looks differently for everybody. It looks differently. So I would also tell them, you know, if you don't know, you gotta ask. And especially if you're working in a culture, you gotta ask, you know, what is it like in your culture? What is it like? What are these parameters that you have? Because if you don't know, you gotta ask, because everybody's culture is different. And so in providing services, that would be key, listening for understanding.
And Dr. Kelly, I'll get to you in just a minute. Dr. Williams, I know that we have a limited number of providers. So therefore, we have to rely on the broader community of providers in order to provide services for people of color, Black people, especially who have suffered trauma. Give us some advice to those practitioners.
To be exact, I looked this up just for y'all. 5% of practitioners are women of color, and 4% African American psychologists. So it's actually pretty bad, you know. And it's not okay to bombard all of the BIPOC clinicians, all of the BIPOC community. You know, like we need more culturally competent practitioners and not just counselors. We need to extend that into the medical profession as well. You know, we need that. And you know what? The work starts internally with you. You need to recognize your bias. You need to recognize your blind spots. What is your worldview? What cultural characteristics about your lived experience might interfere with you understanding your clients or your students, you know, if you're or your trainees experiences. We must start with ourselves first, you know, because if we don't recognize what's happening internally for us, then we're not going to be able to help someone. And you know what? We will do stuff like microaggress on a client or a trainee. And who wants to be in that position? You know, it's terrible. It's a harmful experience for us as practitioners to experience that. So I think it's really important that we remember, you know, as clinicians, we need to check ourselves and see what's going on. And if you have a client and the client seems to be not vibing with you, or the relationship, the therapeutic alliance, there's resistance, or whatever is going on, then you know what? Go talk to your colleague and do some consultation, or your supervisor, so you can understand what's happening internally for you, so you can help that client appropriately, you know, and so that you can identify culturally appropriate or culturally responsive treatments, you know. So I do think that the work begins with us, you know. Yes, and don't, like I said, don't bombard all of the BIPOC clinicians. You know, like it's not okay for us to think that we're the only ones that can work with people of color, you know.
All right, well, Dr. Kelly, you had a comment.
Real quick, because I know we're running out of time. I just wanted to throw out, definitely not. And I do joke about calling Dr. Ash and now you, Dr. Williams, but self-care is important for you guys too. And you need to make sure that you get your level of self-care, because you do hear a lot of traumatizing things, and we don't want you reliving experiences that have been healed and put away and now you're triggered. So I'm always an advocate for self-care. I feel like everybody should get them some, but no matter the way it looks. I actually have a book. So she put in the link, look at it and get you some ideas. So that part.
All right, well, we only have 1 minute left. However, I do want to thank so much this panel. It has been really a blessing to me to have this session. Mental health is something that is so overlooked in our society as a whole, but when you add the additional layers of trauma, lived experience, negative lived experiences, and the lack of appreciation and what I call cultural competency. Someone told me it's a new thing now, but what I'm talking about is the understanding of the differences that your culture has on your reaction to certain things that happen in our society. And so it's very important for everyone to have that understanding. And hopefully we provided those that attended this with information that they could use to really make our community better, because that's what the YW is here for. Our mission is eliminating racism, empowering women, promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And I'm very hopeful that this conversation led to fulfilling at least a portion or parts of that mission. So thank you very much for everyone being here. Thank you, you wonderful sisters. I'm so glad and proud to be part of this with you. So thank you.
Thank you.